Welcome to Alt Consulting, where we do AI adoption conversations. I'm Utsav Bhatt, founder of Stratoff. We help companies drive AI adoption and innovation-led growth. One of the patterns I'm seeing across organizations today is that AI adoption is being treated primarily as a technology problem. Companies are launching copilots, deploying agents, running workshops, tracking token usage, but very few are seeing meaningful transformation in how work actually gets done. And when things fail, we often blame the technology. But what if AI is simply exposing the weaknesses that already existed inside the organization? That's exactly what we are exploring today. My guest today is John. John brings more than 35 years of hands on IT leadership experience and is widely known for his foundational work in DevOps movement. He's the co-author of the DevOps Handbook and the author of Rebels of Reason, a fascinating book tracing the history of AI and the people and ideas that shaped it. Over the years, John has worked across enterprise systems, governance, audit, DevOps, cloud infrastructure, and now increasingly around AI governance and agentic systems. John, it's great to have you today.
It's great to be here. I remember when we first talked about doing the podcast, it seemed like we were on a mind meld, because, I did some research on your background and I'm like, and then when we talked, like, everything you just said in the intro is like spot on. We can end the podcast now. Yes, I agree. Yeah, so, no, it's no good. It's refreshing. I mean, I do a lot of podcasts, but it's refreshing that it seems like we're both on the same wavelength here on some fundamental things that people need to be thinking about right now.
Perfect. Perfect. So you have had a front row seat to multiple technology revolutions over the last, say, 4 to 5 decades, from mainframe to clouds to DevOps and now AI. Now, when you look at the current AI wave, what feels fundamentally different this time and what feels like history is repeating itself?
Yeah, I love this question because one of the things I cover in my book on the Rebels of Reason, which is the history of AI, is I talk about the AI winters and the AI springs, right? And one of the things I wish I would have done this in a book. I thought about this after the book about those are the wrong metaphors, right? They're really more like a fluorescence. And what's interesting about fluorescence, it's about energy. So winters and springs are boom and bust, right? It means like sort of it goes away and then it hibernates and the spring comes. Where fluorescence is the energy is always there. So I like that idea because I think it's a better metaphor for not just AI, but just you said I've done 5 decades of technology shifts and transformations, from mainframes to now, the latest AI um, wave, if you will. They're always in this fluorescence. And I think the thing that you have to sort of decouple is what are the things that your question about like what is different, like, and what feels like history repeating. The difference are the things that are inside the energy of if I'm using the fluorescence, right? And those things are that we do have to fundamentally think different about what this thing can do, this AI, right? It is a machine that gives us unlimited knowledge at machine executable speed, and if we delegate authority, there is potential for catastrophic, and the blast radius is really high. So the things that are different is that I think we've always had complex automation, and automation creates a newer blast radius. But I don't think we've ever had instantaneous access to a corpus of knowledge. We were always mitigated automation by basically the defined rules that you gave it. Now, depending on what delegated authority you give this AI, and this is where we can go into deeper in this later, why I'm very interested in what sort of governance looks like, what internal audit looks like. But then the things are the same. If you think about this sort of energy fluorescence, right? And I really like this metaphor is the things that we know the history repeats, like the social technical system thinking, not just getting focused in completely on the tool adoption, right? We like that's where this AI wave is different. It is a tool adoption from an external point of view, right? And so what that means is we need to understand and obey the history of organizational dynamics. And we've got 100 years of management science. I am a big student. One of my books is about Dr. Deming. I'm a student of the management scientists, the Eastern and the Western, the Deming, Akoff, Sanjay Drucker. And then, I've studied a lot about lean, and lean comes from Toyota Production Systems. And I can go on, and I won't. But Ono, Shingo, Taguchi, there is just a wealth of information about organizational behavior, and we cannot ignore that because we're caught up in the fluorescence or the glow of this fluorescent site. And so that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And with this enormous excitement which is there with
Yeah.
AI right now, every enterprise seems to have their own pilots and co-pilots and AI task force and now chief AI officer, AI councils. But despite all that activity, most organizations are still struggling to translate AI into measurable business impact. So why do you think this gap exists?
Yeah, I liked your sort of framing of this transformation paradox, right? And I think of it, very sort of aligned with that. I think organizations are, again, we're in this sort of glow of and we all fall prey to this, right? I mean, I love experimenting with new technology. Every technology transformation that I've been involved with over the last 5 decades, it starts out, I'm like, I become a geek. I see how far I can take it, how much I learn. And at some point, I remind myself, what do I do? We talk about DevOps. I am basically the O in DevOps. My whole career has been operations and infrastructure. And one of the things I think about as I reflect is when I get out of that sort of fascination phase, I step back and say, what is the technology going to do to an operational infrastructure? More importantly, how do I protect the brand of a regulated or high consequence business? And right now, what we're seeing is there's a lot of confusion between experimentation and what transformation means. And I think most people, in fact, I stand up in front of an audience now, sometimes 1,000 people in a room. And I say this, I'll say, prototype does not equal production. And then I kind of half jokingly apologize that I have to say that out loud in 2026, you know? Um, I think we're not learning from what a prototype is. A prototype is a learning artifact. Basically production is a liability artifact. And I think we're just missing a lot of signals because of this fluorescence. And then you talk about organizational change, right? This wave of AI and every technology transformation I've been involved, it it needs some type of systemic organizational change to adapt. And there's this phrase, social technical, which comes from like, I think it's a 19th century sociologist who studied coal miners, right? And this idea that like it's not just the technical and it's not just the humans, it's this system where humans work together. And again, I think every technology is with we forget these things. We have to learn, and then we kind of come to the enlightenment that it isn't just the technology, stupid.
Yeah. No, I think the point that you mentioned that a lot of people confuse with the shiny new promise which a technology brings, but look into more deeply what operational impact it might have and look at the operating model. That brings me to a sort of a point that we discussed earlier, which is operationally, then people start measuring different metrics to see how effectively they are using AI, and they come to, hey, my token usage is so and so. And now with OpenAI and Claude and others sort of doling out all these awards of 1 million token or 1 billion token,
Yeah,
people
yeah.
are sort of talking about it. Now, can you unpack that a bit in terms of token economics is what people are focusing on rather than value economics?
Yeah, and I think there's two ways to break this down, right? And I'll start with the sort of the negative. I think, again, the idea that where is history repeating itself? I'm old enough to be like in the 80s and 90s, 1980s. Now I'm not that old. 1980s and 1990s, we used to do 1,000 lines KLOCs, we called it, right? Or cost per KLOC or KLOC per person. And by the time we got into the 2000s and Agile and DevOps, we sort of realized that was sort of nonsense, right? And here we are again, where CEOs and CIOs are saying, "Oh, we increased our uh, AI adoption from 25 cents to 25% to 35%, or we're doing this many pull requests, or this token leaderboard." nonsense, right? Jensen Hung, right, like recently said that, if a $500,000 a year did not consume at least 250,000 tokens, like then there's something wrong, right? Like he's deeply alarmed, as he said. Like this is what's missing in both of those, the KLOCs and token. It's value, capital V value. I don't care how many tokens. I didn't care how many KLOCs. Did we not learn that? And KLOCs can be gamed. Tokens are being gamed. Token leaderboards are literally, you're forcing humans to say, "Hey, I'm going to pat you on the head because you've used more tokens." What do you think they're going to focus on? As opposed to, I'll go back to the Deming and the giants of management scientists, in my opinion. They would tear this. They'd be, Deming isn't alive today, but he'd be ripping this apart. And I think the one thing I will say is the idea of token economics. I think we need to separate, and I think again we're conflating, token usage and token leaderboard and token consumption with, what is the fintech aspect, and that's a real valid argument. And one last thing I like to say too is what I care about is, are we learning, right? And so, and the other thing we kind of constantly look at is like the S curve, things like diffusion, innovation, or chasm. I'm very focused on the idea of a J curve, right? Instead of sort of everything's incremental, the J curve gives you this idea that you're you sort of dip and then you recover and you improve. So all this discussion about AI failing, and there are a lot of failures, but I think the organizations that I work with either understand or I help them understand that if you can look at this not as failure, because what is failure? It's a learning opportunity. And if you look at it like you are in this dip or the bottom of the J curve, then you can sort of calibrate, how do you climb out of there? And what are you learning? What are you doing wrong? What are you learning from what you're doing wrong? And I think we're just not asking the right questions. And I think metrics is a really, a good point to start with is, are we asking the right questions by what we're observing? And the answer I say is no right now.
Yeah, I think there is another sort of point which I want to bring in with this conversation around what kind of metrics we are measuring. There is also a behavior that we have seen for a long time in organizations with IT. There's a concept of shadow IT, which for listeners who don't understand, it's a term which is used to say basically software, hardware, or cloud services which are used within an organization without explicit approval by the IT department or their oversight. This is essentially driven by people who want to drive some productivity improvement, but it causes potential security compliance concerns and data leakage issues because they lack central management. Now we are also hearing terms like shadow AI and uncontrolled agent sprawl. How serious is this becoming inside enterprises, especially say regulated industries? Because
Yeah, no,
everyone
yeah,
$20 license, they go and put some data and they feel like it's protected.
yeah. No, I think, there's a meta conversation about this shadow, concept. The shadow IT was driven heavily by cloud, right? Like, and then so shadow AI now is really the same thing. In fact, there's sort of this sort of swing back that like now with agents, we're creating shadow IT version 2, right? In other words, the whole, we've now come full circle. But and there's two ways to look at it. There's the pressure points of an organization. I guess it all goes back to this. If leadership is not giving the right direction, and a lot of times they can't give the right direction because they don't really understand their organization. They have different goals. And so what happens in an organization is you have, I like to put things in three, make my life simple, make my explanations more simple. Is you have three groups of people, and I know you have more than three, but you have basically the people who are basically innovators that are going to use the latest tools. And if leadership is not setting the right boundaries or giving the right definitions, then they're going to basically do now, ask forgiveness later, and solve problems. And more often than not, they win. Like if they do something great, it's like, yeah, you shouldn't have done it that way, but pat on the back. Then you get that middle group who's like kind of stuck in the middle. They know they should be using some of the advanced AI tools, but they're kind of torn because they haven't gotten any direction, and they're the kind of people that actually like to follow directions, but they're innovators. And then you have the other group who are basically, hey, I work from 8 to 5, like just let me do my job, right? And that's your talent plane. Now you're trying to sort of like be concerned about like what is, we want to do this or we don't want to do this, and you're not giving clarity of what you can do and can't do or what you should be doing in this organization. And what is the danger of shadow IT? It's the same danger now exponentially with shadow AI, which is, to your point, we create a level of risk. The biggest problem that happened in shadow IT with cloud, which was organizations didn't tell their employees or technologists that they could or couldn't use cloud. They kind of deferred the answer. So that third group went ahead and used it. And there was no sort of connection to, internal audit, governance, risk control, compliance, all those things. And what we found in the first wave was like these horror stories where, critical, intellectual property wound up on somebody's cloud that were publicly accessible. Right. And so what we came back and we started doing data classification, and like we matured about how, and then regulatory bodies got more involved in like, hey, if you're bank, this is what you can use for cloud. And then we had FedRAMP and all that stuff. Well, we're in the pre-FedRAMP, we're in a pre-data classification phase right now with a tool, like I said earlier, that has a set of tools that have, unlimited knowledge at speed, at machine executable speed, and any sort of inch that we give it in delegated authority, again, this is not a deterministic, here's the rules, do this. This is sort of a gateway to catastrophe. So all the same problems apply, but now they're exponential in terms of the risk.
Right. In fact, the point that you mentioned around like, how agents are exploding within organizations, and it becomes difficult to track them with sort of shadow AI now becoming a big problem. It reminded me of the work which I used to do around a decade back. So I was running a practice called application portfolio rationalization, where we will go and find out applications which companies are running. And I was so surprised in certain situations, we could find applications which neither business was owning nor IT was owning. They did not know where it was running, and people have left. So nobody knows where's the instance of that application. Now, I almost think that terminology of that practice was called APR, application portfolio rationalization. I'm sure in 5 years, we'll have agentic portfolio rationalization, because you'll have so many front-end marketing agents, sales agents, you have back-end IT ticketing system agents, and people will sort of find it very difficult to get their hands on, which one is actually better than the other, how are they doing, from a performance perspective. So it's interesting how this will evolve, but this also sort of raises a concern. Those, like the three groups of people that you mentioned, there's some who are quite risk averse, and they are waiting and watching. And every example which comes in the in the newspapers or on any blog post around, hey, because of AI this problem happened, they sort of take into the organizations and talk about perils of using AI, and we should be more cautious in our approach. We should be followers of others. So there was an incident that we were discussing earlier around a whole production database was deleted, and then they blamed AI for it. So how can organizations learn from this? Because as we experiment, and those innovators who are trying to do new things will end up doing a few things which might harm an organization. So how do you sort of manage such a issue?
Yeah, no, I think you're going back to this, like, what are the things that are, history repeating itself, and I again, I like to bring up the organizational, management, organizational dynamics, the things that we've learned. And, if I was just to sort of say, Dr. Deming, Edward Deming, um, you know, he would basically look at AI right now and he would tell you that if a system is poorly designed, AI will help you create defects faster. Russell Ackoff, one of the top systems thinkers, would say AI will accelerate broken process. If you haven't transformed your organization, you have industrialized dysfunction. And Peter Senge, who's still alive, who is, the fifth discipline guy, he would say that, that you would basically say, the organizations are not the ones who deploy the most AI. They're the ones that use AI. Back to the metrics question. So the thing we talked about is that Pocket OS, right? And this is an interesting story. It's a company, the headlines are, a company's whole database has been deleted in 9 seconds and its backups too, right? Well, I dug a little deep on that, right? And therein lies, like Deming's saying, like if you have a poorly designed system and you delegate the wrong level of authority, bad things will happen. I mean, I've been, for the last year and a half, almost 2 years, I've been tracking almost as a hobby rogue agent. And I've got like all these great stories of rogue agent, not even the public ones, people that come up to me and tell me how they use, Git, and Git hallucinated on a command and it deleted their repo, right? Like these, it was Claude code, right? But the thing is that when with the case of the Pocket OS, they had a terribly designed architecture. They had the backups on the same volume as the production system. They were, as far as I could say, this is a counterfactual, but they were lazy in that used super tokens. They didn't use a cloud service provider that had extremely robust, like why you don't use Amazon Cloud today, or even Google Cloud, but Amazon's cloud. It has a robust set of, identity and IAM and features. And now you may not take advantage of them. You still might use root user. But what they did is they literally took all the shortcuts. And then they decided to use Claude code. Sorry, what? Like again, that's a tale of two cities. Can AI wipe out your whole business? Absolutely. Do you have a poorly designed system? It probably will. Do you have a reasonably designed system where you're not using super tokens and you're not putting the backups on the, I mean, if you've been in IT for more than like 4 days, you probably know you shouldn't put backups on the same volume as your production systems, right? So again, that's the interesting tale of two cities, is that a lot of these catastrophes are, I had another solution where this was an interesting rogue activity. They decided that they literally want to get a list of servers in there, and they were, PCI, regulated. It was a regulated business, credit card use and stuff like that. And somebody wanted to use Claude code, and basically they figured, you know what? Let me use Claude code, and I'm just going to use Claude code to go get a list of servers that I might want to remediate some patches for. And they used a super user, like what they call firecall, which was a root access for a small period of time. And so they thought that Claude code was going to act the way a human would. A human would probably go to the load balancer, it would go to some registry that might have all the servers, right? Well, the agent, because it was in root, it had root access, it saw there was a secrets manager called Vault available, and it literally made the decision on its own to say, that's going to be a much quicker way. And it went ahead and then loaded all the secrets into the public Anthropic Claude frontier model. And this poor kid had for the 3 days, rotate, every, with his boss standing over him, kind of yelling at him. But the point is that was a terrible idea. And going back to the leadership problem, I'm not saying leaders going to basically tell every person when and what particular scenario they should be using Claude, an agentic process would say Git or systems like solutions. But what I'm saying is try to ask some questions. I run a workshop on agentic automated governance, right? And one of the things that, like, I tell people, I don't know the answers. These are complicated questions right now, incredibly complicated questions. And all I'm telling you is what I'm doing in my first couple of revs of this workshop is forcing you to ask questions about what you're trying to do. And what are the questions you should be asking? And then you can ask deeper questions. It's first principles, first principle thinking, systems thinking. And again, I think we're in that fluorescence. We're thinking this is all new, so everything's new territory. And some of it is new territory, but some of it is just basics that we should know better.
No, I think two thoughts actually came to my mind while you were sharing that. First was the way we set up this conversation. You exactly made the same point. Uh, this might actually, the whole AI adoption might actually be exposing weaknesses which already exist in the
Hmm.
organization. And the other thought was this is similar to the conversation which people were having when big data came into picture. Hey, we are doing big data, we'll do analysis on it, but if you have garbage data which is not organized, not
Correct.
structured, not captured, you have accuracy issues, then whatever you do on top of it, it's not going to, yield any. But in that case, at least you just had a visualization or interpretation of data. Here, this might be much more severe because you might allow agent to take a decision on your behalf and then sort of go back looking at the problems it faces. So when you do these workshops, and one thing which actually scares me a bit is the whole agents. Like, I've done some workshops with people talking about how you develop agents for marketing team and sales team and others.
Hmm.
We hadn't even had those conversation in depth with companies, and then this autonomous agent concept came in, and companies latched on it and like, yeah, we'll do autonomous agent. You don't have right now foundation ready to do a simple agent in your organization which is foolproof, tested, works really well, gives you the benefit, and now you're moving towards fully agentic system which are autonomous. So, although this is a very complicated question to answer, but what are some sort of two, three guiding principles that you tell organizations that they should keep in mind when they are trying to adopt AI, especially those organizations which might not have a good foundation or might not have a good understanding of what underlying infrastructure exists?
Yeah, I think the data science is a good example because that sort of came right, like sort of leaped on top of cloud or, very close to each other in terms of the birth and the growth, right? And one of the things I think is interesting in the data science and the, what space, which was bad data actually has a cost, right? And it's the same thing with inference now, because I want to break down it. There's sort of two things we need to think about. And a lot of what we need to think about is data, right? So it's in very well much similar. And the problem with data science is depending on what those answers are providing. Like I always talk about like if somebody wants to build a chat bot in an organization, what's the risk? Well, if it's an internal chat, it's let's say it's a chat bot on where to go to lunch at corporate headquarters. Yeah, the risk is very low. But what if it's a chat bot that sort of organizes logistics internally? Now, is that brand reputation? Probably not. Can you get regulated severe enforcement? Probably not. Can you waste $5 million in a year because you had 80,000 employees following these rules, right? And it was the bad, non-optimum advice, right? So now you have the same problem in inference, right? And you have twofold problems with inference, right? When inference, I talk about like generative AI giving you answers, right? So you have this assistance mode, which is either code assistance or knowledge assistance, right? And the question then is the first couple of advice questions is do you are you can you share or can you understand the provenance of the data that is creating the answers and the inference or the probabilistic answers, right? And there's a whole like if you look at OWASP LM Top 10, which is a great resource for like prompt injections and all the ways that you can get into a lot of trouble for what's called tainted propagation of data. And so that's again like it's no difference in cloud. What would we find out when I said earlier, when we found out we let the early adopters do what they wanted because we didn't tell them what they couldn't do. They did the do now, ask for years later. The first thing we found was a lot of data showed up in the cloud that shouldn't have been there. And then we pulled it back and we did data classification. So first and foremost, what data is being used to create assisted answers, questions, code, and then the scarier question now is what data is being used to create decisions that have consequences, and this is the agentic stuff. So it always goes back to data. There's been some great presentations by Meta about like how they've been using agentics, sort of in anger for a while now. And they recently gave a conference presentation where they talked about, that what they'll find is in the most curated atomic execution of agents, they still find that out of, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but out of like 100 calls to a tool, 95 will be the right tool, like tool X, and 5 of them will be Y. And like that's the nature of the beast. There's a percentage of risk when you're doing probabilistic, which is what we're doing now. And so organizations have to understand the data and the risk that they're willing to accept if they're going to use these tools to answer questions, particularly if the answers are in regulatory, like they're under regulatory bounds, right? Finance or whatever. And then if they're going to take actions,
Yeah.
there's a risk. And I think the reality check is people are not learning from the history of like, okay, before we do this, let's understand the data. Let's understand the risk surface. Is this agent able to read? Is this, and the risks there are that, there are actually some executable read-only hacks and sort of, but then can it write can it mutate a production service? Can it execute in a multi-system environment? And what's really fascinating to me is I'm talking to some of the largest organizations on the planet, and the advisors that are like very high up at the architectural level of these organizations are telling me these questions are not being asked.
Yeah. So, we have spoken about a lot of technical details, which people who work behind the scenes managing AI implementation would really resonate with. But just the last question for leaders who are running their businesses, either business unit heads or the CEO, CSO, who are overwhelmed by the pace of AI change right now, because every other day there's a new vendor coming in talking about how they can
Mm-hmm.
bring in AI, and they are listening to podcasts, they are listening to conversations which are happening at keynotes which are being given. What are some first principles that they should get back to, like as a leader when you're overwhelmed with the amount of information on AI that is coming your way? What you should practically do in next, say, 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I like your framing of reimagine, redesign, realize, right? Because I don't use those exact terms, but I think about, and this is what I do with leaders. The first question I like to ask, because I have leaders that tell me, John, I don't think my organization can understand AI. Am I, and they're like literally begging me to tell them, yeah, you should bring in a really large consulting company to help you. And like, that's never going to be my first answer. It may be one of my answers. But then the first question I ask is, you have an innovation plan. Like you think there's an organizational structure, you've got pressures from the sort of market pressures, you've got executive pressures, you've got, you've got audit and risk pressures. But what you don't have, and then your good leaders do a pretty good job of trying to create innovation strategy. But what they don't do a good job with, almost universally, is understanding their talent. And you can't have an innovation strategy without understanding your talent. And so when I think about the transformation of any transformation, but certainly this AI wave we're in right now, is do you have a very simple question? And if you don't understand the question, let's deeper dive. I'm not saying you, but the executive that I'm working with is, do you have a talent and innovation strategy? Because if you don't have both, like what is your talent? Is it those three categories? Well, that's probably the first thing I need to fix. I need my talent to be on the same wavelength. And I need clarity. And if the people who are the 8 to 5ers don't want to do AI, then maybe they're not in the right place. And if the people in the middle are like, want to use AI, but they don't know what, we need clarity. And then, the sort of that third group, whoa, hold on there, buddy. Don't use OpenClaw. Like, maybe we should hold off on using something that right now in a high consequence business. So you need to understand where your talent is. And I'm a big fan of like qualitative analysis. I've done many of these over the years where you go in, and I did one a few summers back. It's before the AI phase. It was about DevSecOps, IT risk and audit and all that. And, I interviewed like 300-400 people in a bank that managed 10 trillion in asset holdings. And it was incredible when I gave that report to the CIO about what he didn't realize his organization was doing. In fact, at first they get mad at me. They like pound the desk. It can't be so, the big five told us that we were great at this, and I can't, like, no, I mean, like, I can't make this stuff up. I got it from your people. And here's the one other problem. A lot of organizations that come in when a CIO is sort of asking me to give them the green light to go bring in a large consulting organization. I don't know if the big four these days or big five. I can't keep count, but I'll say the big five, and I'm probably wrong. Um, the but they want the green light, and my question is like, they're going to talk to the leaders. And we have this thing where we call the green shading, right? Like everything at the bottom is like red. It turns as it goes up a level, it becomes a little yellow. You know, as it goes up a little higher, it gets a shade of green. By the time it gets the executive, it's green, right? And some people call it the watermelon effect, right? In other words, it's sort of green on the outside, it's all red in the middle. And unless you're basically talking to the talent, the people that put their fingers on the keyboards. And how many times I've gone into an organization where I talk to the people with fingers keyboard, and they just spent 18 months with a big five, and they laugh and say, you're the first person that's actually come to talk to us about this. So again, I think there are, and this is just sort of Management Science 101. Read a book by Deming, read a book by Senge, read a
Yeah.
book by Akoff, read a book by Drucker, and the list
Yeah.
can go on and on and on. And you'll get the same sort of, like, I'm not some genius that made all this stuff up, like I'm just following the playbooks that have been laid
Yeah.
out for us.
And working in the consulting industry for 18 years now, the reason I sort of branched out and tried to do my own thing was I feel a lot of these answers don't lie with hiring a big four, big five consulting firm. What they actually need is some time to spend within the organization to have some thoughtful conversation on
So,
where
yep,
you're headed, what you want to reimagine, what's the problem, how do you overcome that, and maybe a big four could come in for doing the final board level alignment because you need to get budgets for moving things forward. But the whole analysis could be
that's
done
right.
differently.
That's right.
That's
Yes.
what sort of I also bring in the book Alt Consulting, which I authored. This talks about the same thing: unbundle consulting, do your analysis with a different set of providers, much like they're taking advice from you rather than hiring an Accenture and saying, please tell me what I should do with AI.
Yeah.
Similar to the business side, just try to get it done differently. And then if you need leadership alignment, we could do that. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's
No,
that's
no,
exactly
I
where to
I
go.
think you're spot on this. I've read a lot of your stuff. I still got your book in my shelf. I want to read it because I think fundamentally we are aligned in this. Back in the 1990s and 2000s, that sort of between that year 2K thing, I did a lot of work with IBM companies that were around the IBM portfolio. And the idea was get in, get out, teach your client to fish. I think you talk about like being an advisor, and
Yeah.
I don't know where butts and seats. Sorry for like explaining it that way, but I don't know where butts and seats consulting lands in today's world because there's a lot of build versus buy things going on right now in large organizations. The ability to create your own solutions is, there's a lot of sort of dust that needs to settle. But I've always felt that the first order process should never be bring in a big five.
Yeah.
In fact, for a couple of reasons. One is I would tell, when I did the qualitative analysis, one of my cells was I would tell a CIO, large corporations. I mean, one was, again, a 10 trillion asset holding, but I did some really banked, large healthcare. And I'd say, here's the difference between me and them. One is, I'm going to tell you the absolute truth. Oh, John, we want the truth. No, no, you're not going to like the truth. And you're going to get mad. Oh, no, no, John, and I said, but here's the thing. I'm not sticking around. So I don't care, like, if you get mad at me. And you will, by the way, pound your fist on the desk. I guarantee you when some of the things I'm going to tell you. And I said,
Yeah.
but here's the thing. You're going to pay me regardless, and it is an enlightened because they've been through so many. Because what does the big five want to do when they're doing the advisement? It's sort of the green shading problem. They're not going to
Yeah.
walk into the CIO and tell him all the horrible things because I'm telling you, even though they promise me they're not going to get mad at me, and I don't mind because I'm like, you know what? If this works, you'll call me back in a year from now, or the 5 years or
Yeah.
3 years from now, when there's another technology explosion, and you trust me. But I'm in here for a short period of time, and my answer will probably be, it's usually going to be a mid-size, like a consulting business that I have a lot of, there's a couple that I think are really good at implementation, I reckon, but I'm not like immune to a big five as well.
Yeah.
I had a CIO one time where they had like 18 months, they had one of the big five in there, and I came in for a month. And when I gave the report, she was just not furious at me, just furious. She's like, you found out more in a month than they found in 18 months.
Yeah.
But the joke is on me. They charge like $400,000, $500,000, maybe a
Yeah.
million. I
Correct.
charged like $300,000.
Yeah.
For like it was more than a month, but about 100,000 a month, right? So but anyway, that's the way I roll. I don't come in, but I think the point is people like us, they're like, why not invest in us first?
Yeah.
One, we're going to give you the brutal truth. We want to be your advisor. I want you to trust me more than anything. Large companies sort of delegate trust because they want long-term business,
Yes.
right? Yeah, and so I think you're spot on. I do think the idea of consulting, I think it's a fascinating conversation to have about how, the landscape of consulting business has been changing for years. Now I think it's got a wedge in it because
Yeah.
of all this sort of new AI wave.
And I think now it's becoming more affordable for people, say mid-sized companies who could never earlier,
Yeah,
reach out to them, because consulting is also getting partially automated and another is getting,
that's right.
done differently. But John, this was a fascinating conversation. I think one of the biggest takeaways for everyone listening to this is that AI is not just about introducing a new technology, a
That's right.
new shiny technology. It's exposing old organizational assumptions, weak operating models, unclear governance, and maybe leadership gaps that may have already existed, but we never knew about them. And perhaps
That's
the
right.
companies that succeed won't necessarily be the ones with the most AI tools or most number of tokens, as we discussed, but the ones which are willing to rethink how they operate. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, that was great. I loved our pre-conversation, and I knew this would be a lot of fun because we are definitely aligned on the way we're thinking. I think you're spot on in the way you're thinking about this problem. So great. Now,
Great.
thank you so much.
Thank you.